So I just want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me today to explore what it means to cultivate humanity in higher education, not only as a theoretical ideal, but as a lived ethical and institutional practice. It's not something I get to talk about much anymore in my current role. I'm working primarily in clinical trial research, so I really welcome this opportunity to be involved in this very important discussion. And echoing my colleagues who spoke earlier, I don't see myself as an expert on this topic, but what I'm talking about today is very personal to me. It's grounded in my own very deep conviction that universities can be more than gatekeepers of knowledge. I think that they can be sites of transformation, and I've argued for that in some of my previously published work. So just as a little overview of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to start off talking about Martha Nussbaum's vision brought on by their university learning. And I think it's not often enough, and certainly infrequently outside of service learning courses or in community engagement activities. Now, what scholars like Mitchell calls critical service learning is an approach that links local engagement to broader structures of injustice. Starting locally, I argue, is pedagogically powerful. And this is what community engagement asks us to do. When students encounter difference, marginalization, or resilience in their own communities, I think they're better equipped to recognize similar dynamics on a global scale. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting that this is about scaling up empathy. It's about recognizing the patterned nature of inequality and power. Local engagement, I think, also facilitates ethical proximity. Students are not asked to imagine the other, but to engage with people as neighbors, collaborators, partners, people who are very different to themselves. And this local relationality enables development of a more grounded and informed global consciousness for students. I think often in traditional service learning, there was a bit of a tendency to romanticize the voice of the other, but critical perspectives have challenged this, and they urge us to cultivate dialogical imagination, what Freire called dialogue grounded in love, humility, and faith in people's capacity to create and recreate. So, narrative imagination, in this sense, and in community engaged practice, is not an individual capacity, but a relational practice, actually. And in community engagement, students are not simply reading about others' experiences and trying to imaginatively step into their shoes. They're engaging in reciprocal storytelling, witnessing, and sometimes co-authoring real change. And this requires, I think, the kind of deep listening, ethical humility, and a willingness to be transformed that goes well beyond what we might see through simply cultivating a moral imagination as we might do in other subjects. So, in my honest reflection, working in engaged teaching and research spaces for over a decade, community engagement is not easy. It's not easy. It's often messy. It's incredibly relationally demanding. And more often than not, it's institutionally undervalued. Um, but it's also transformative, not because it fixes problems, because it reorients us. It invites us into a shared vulnerability, into shared responsibility, where learning is mutual and knowledge generation is actually an ethical act. And I think working in South Africa for many years at Rhodes with Di Hornby and her team has shaped my understanding of community engagement as fundamentally oriented towards justice, both social justice and epistemic justice. And as a social justice, community engagement is obviously a massive response to structural inequality. And in South Africa, this includes racialized poverty and educational exclusion. And here, community engagement is a means of redistributing access to institutional resources, whether those are material, intellectual, or actually relational, which I think is very important. But more than redistribution, obviously, community engagement in the South African context is also about reparation. It asks, how can the university contribute to healing ruptures that have been caused by apartheid and ongoing marginalization? Now, in practice, this might mean supporting community-led initiatives, resisting extractive research practices, or investing in partnerships that prioritize community-defined goals. Social justice and community engagement requires decentering of academic authority in that way, and a commitment also to sustained presence, which I think some of my other colleagues have also mentioned. I've also for quite a long time spoken and written about community engagement's role in epistemic justice. Here, community engagement challenges the dominance of Western elite and institutional ways of knowing. People like Miranda Fricker and other decolonial scholars' work shows us how we can see community engagement as a means to recognize and elevate historically excluded knowledge systems, be they indigenous, experiential, oral, or relational. And so in this way, community engagement not only opens a space for diverse voices, it asks us to reconsider what counts as knowledge and how that knowledge is being validated. And in practice, epistemic justice and community engagement might involve things that are incredibly difficult to do, but very important, including co-authorship of papers with community members, creating spaces for storytelling or art as valid forms of evidence, still not widely accepted, or critically examining who is considered an expert. This, I think, is the most difficult challenge to overcome in the work that we do. It's also about resisting the idea that university knowledge is inherently superior, and community engagement enables that shift by positioning knowledge as relational, situated, and co-creative. I think that this shift is slow. It's like moving the Titanic, the shift that we're making in changing the way we understand higher education. But it is happening. Not fast enough, of course. Now, people like De Souza Santos and Lagrange remind us that justice in education means expanding who gets to be seen, to know, what counts as knowledge, and how that knowledge is produced. And Nussbaum calls in her work for narrative imagination, but I think we've got to ask more questions of it. We have to ask who gets to narrate. And in the South African context, community engagement asks this uncomfortable question. It's at its very heart, right? Community engagement is a practice of refusal and imagination, a refusal to reproduce colonial hierarchies of knowledge and power, and an invitation to imagine a more just, more dialogical, more humanizing way that we can work with communities, with knowledge, and with each other. So in that way, I think it's an interesting method of confronting historical harm and trying to share authority in knowledge production. What I think, however, is that there are limits to both the humanities curriculum and community engagement when institutional culture is hostile, indifferent, or extractive. Even the most compelling texts or the most meaningful engagements fall very flat if the university culture itself is not one where human dignity, reflection, and ethical relationships are actually valued. All of our efforts to cultivate humanity, whether in the classroom or in community spaces, can actually be undermined by the culture of the university itself. I have seen brilliant engagement work suffocated by metrics, competition, and neglect. And what I want to suggest is that cultivating humanity is not possible without a culture that nurtures it. And the university needs to become a place where people are seen as more than instruments of productivity, a place where ethical encounters and reflective practices are cultivated institutionally and not just individually as they are currently being done. I think we often speak of the university as a neutral space, somewhere that's committed to inquiry, progress, and reason. But really, that's a myth. And the university is not neutral. It's a site of struggle, of cultural and epistemic reproduction. But I guess at its best, it's a site of potential transformation. The university certainly reproduces inequality when it valorizes certain knowledge systems over other, and when academic labor is competitive rather than collaborative, and when students are viewed as consumers rather than co-creatives. But it also holds that transformative potential, right? When we take seriously the question, what kind of institution do we want the university to be? So I think to truly cultivate humanity, institutions need to model the very values we aim to teach. If we want our students to cultivate humanity, I think we have to ask ourselves a very hard question. What do they see when they look at us? And I think that suggests reimagining academic relationships at every level in how academics relate to one another. So I think collegiality needs to go beyond performative niceness. It needs to encompass intellectual humility, the ability to listen across difference, and the courage to support one another in the face of institutional pressure. I wonder how often our promotion structures actually actively reward collaboration. How often is care for our colleagues viewed and recognized as an institutional priority? I suggest too rarely. Yet these practices are foundational to any institution that claims to value human dignity. I think they're also foundational not just for staff well-being, but because students are watching. Students are watching. As educators and mentors, we model ways of relating, disagreeing, and supporting one another. And if we hope to cultivate humanity in our students, we've got to embody it in our own interactions as people who work in a higher education institution. And when students witness generosity, solidarity, and principled disagreement from us, we really offer them a living example of ethical engagement. And this is part of the hidden curriculum and one of the most powerful tools that we actually have at our disposal. I think we also should think about our relationships with students themselves. Obviously, teaching needs to be rooted in recognition, co-learning, and mentorship, but also how we treat students as members of the university community. And this isn't about lowering standards, it's about relational rigor and institutional accountability. When students raise concerns about pedagogy, access, well-being, or justice, how do we respond to them? Are their voices heard with respect? Are they managed and deflected? I think relational integrity here demands that we see students not as passive recipients of knowledge, not simply as consumers, but as partners in shaping the academic environment. And that means valuing their insights, listening deeply to their critiques, and responding not just with empathy, but with meaningful action to their concerns. Thinking about the difference between, no, I was going to give you an example, but I'm not going to because I can see my time is sort of running out. What I do want to say is that not all students will approach this work in the same way, right? And that's okay. The goal isn't to impose some kind of moral agenda on students, but to create spaces where deeper questions can be asked and where students feel invited, not coerced, to engage with them. And very finally, I want to talk about how research itself is done. I think in a truly humanizing institution, we would support research that's ethical, reflective, and socially engaged. And to do this, we've got to value reflexivity, co-production, and lived experience, not as add-ons, but as essential to good scholarship. And these principles have to be embedded not only in how we design and conduct research, but also how research is published, funded, and rewarded. I think far too often the pressures of competitive funding environments and performance-based research assessments and incentives like speed, volume, and novelty, these things are valued over integrity, accountability, and care. And we see this reflected in unethical practices, inadequate consent processes, tokenistic partnerships, exploitive authorship hierarchies, which I see all the time, and the prioritization of impact over reciprocal benefit and sustained partnership. And all of these practices, I think, are symptoms of a deeper cultural problem, one where the ends of research are disconnected from the values of justice and humanity. And I think this matters not just for research participants and communities, but also for students. As emerging scholars and future academics, students internalize what research is and what it looks like to do it well. So if we want them to cultivate humanity by being involved in a research institution, they need to see models of practice where ethics are not bureaucratic hurdles, but deeply held commitments. They also need to learn that knowledge is not neutral, that who we include and how we include them matters, and that research must be accountable to the communities it seeks to serve. And these practices are not incidental. They are the conditions under which the university can become a space of moral and relational growth. And they need to be lived, not just written in strategy documents. So I think changing that culture starts with very small but systemic shifts, rewarding co-authorship in promotion policies, funding long-term community partnerships, and embedding reflexivity training into our doctoral education. So these pillars that I've suggested, I think, are not checklists, but they are relational commitments woven into how we work, learn, and live together in a university. They offer a kind of cultural orientation, not towards perfection, but towards intentionality and care. So we need relational practices among academics. We need transformative pedagogical relationships, and we need ethical, reflective research cultures. This is how we embed humanity into the routines of academic life. It's through our relationships, through our teaching, and through our research. And these changes in our way of being academics are not easy. They require a lot of institutional will, not just our own individual commitment. But I don't think that they're utopian. I think there are growing movements within academia pushing towards these values, from things like participatory ethics committees to co-designed curricula. So in wrapping up what I've been saying today, I think that Nussbaum gives us a really good starting point for thinking about the why of cultivating humanity. She shows us that education must be about ethical development, not just technical training. I can see my time checks coming in. This is the last slide. Community engagement offers us a how, though. It grounds those ideals in practice, in relationships, in context. And institutional culture is the where in many ways, the environment that either nourishes or stifles these efforts. And without that culture, even the best intentions are going to struggle to take root. So this is why I think we must all think not only about what we teach or how we engage, but about the cultures we reproduce in our everyday lives as academics, in meetings, in classrooms, in corridors. Transformation doesn't happen in strategy documents. It happens in how we show up every day. So that's all from me. I'm trying to work out how to stop sharing. There we go. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paphitis, and please forgive me for mispronouncing your name earlier. We do still have time for at least one or two quick questions before the next presentation. I'm going to check and see if there are any inputs from the chat. All right, there's two questions and I'll cap it just at that. Please do forgive me. I'll start with Dr. Leah Shibambo, followed by Professor Petro Tepescu. Dr. Leah.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity. And yeah, I think this presentation, Doc, you have raised a lot of thought-provoking questions and the need for universities to do an introspection. But having noted your assertion on the responsibility of the institution, my question is more on the part of the students. There is a need to challenge our students. I believe there's a need to challenge our students to develop a certain level of passion towards the CE, so that they can see it not as an end in itself. What I find is that students mostly participate in community engagements. They see it as a requirement from the institution. They see it as, something they have to do as part of the work or their studies while they are with us. So my question is, what is it that we can do to make sure that they begin to see it as something they can continue even beyond their studies, or even after they've left a specific institution? As you indicated, that CE is not easy, but how can we influence them to understand this moral aspect, and for us to make sure that it's one of those student attributes that we need them to acquire? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shibambo. Dr. Sharli, I'm going to ask you to just take the questions and respond to them all at once. So we'll jump to Prof. Babensky, and then I'll read one question in the chat and then give you a chance, if that's all right.
I'm probably going to forget what was said if we do it that way. So I'll just briefly respond now by saying, I think we've had some good suggestions over the course of today. I think you're right about this. I do think we've got to be challenging our students. I do think that for many students, it can become just one of those additional things we have to take, a bit like a stats course that everyone cries through and then moves on from. And we don't want to be doing that. But how to actually build in that change in a way of being is part of our pedagogical task in integrating community engagement into the structures of the university, into the curriculum, into the way we teach students how to do research and involve them in research. And I guess many of the things I've been saying are trying to answer that question, but perhaps not well enough. And I guess by modeling these things to students, by modeling that passion, we are giving students a reason to want to do these things, following what we do. And the more they do it, the more they see the benefits of doing that themselves going forward. But I think we also make a culture in which this is how we be in the world, right? So I don't think that answers your questions in terms of how do we pedagogically do this. I think that's a topic for another round table because it's difficult. But I think we have had some suggestions from colleagues. So I'll just say that, and hopefully other people will jump in.
Thank you, Dr. Sharli. Professor Tabensky.
Hey, Sharli, fantastic talk. Thanks a lot. I agree with everything. Just feel like carrying on and thinking more deeply. And I'm wondering a couple of things. One is, if community engaging was properly integrated into the university, it would no longer be community engaging. It would just be what we do, students and staff. So community engagement went away. The word would no longer be of any use. And the other thing is the phrase. And the other thing is, and part of the story, and this is a bit that interests me, is that the epistemic project itself, I think, is hampered by the fact that we view the epistemic agent as a headless, as a bodiless head. And I think community engagement adds to that. So that's just an addition to your thinking, which I think is consistent with what you've been saying. And it's an invitation to think more carefully about what the point of the epistemic project is in the first place, and to what extent the things that we actually are doing in the university, the current university system, is deeply deleterious to actually understanding, which is, I think, the height of irony, if I'm right.
Professor Tabensky for that. Dr. Sharli, I don't know if you want to say anything to that input or...
I just want to say, I think you are right, Pedro. That's all. You are right.
Come on, man, say a bit more.
What do you want me to say more about? Community engagement, would it go away? I'm not sure about this. I think that's something Di and I have discussed many times, when Di has said what we're trying to do is work ourselves out of a job in the community engagement office. And for me, I'm not sure that that's really where we would go if we fully embed this into our teaching and we fully embed it into our research practices. I think a couple of things. One, I think there's always room for people who have particular skills in navigating the difficulties of community engagement. I think that for many academics running their own engaged programs, running their own teaching, this isn't what they were trained in. Even if they did community engagement their whole time coming up through university, they were trained in other disciplines. They have other expertise. And there are people who focus on the scholarship of engagement, who understand relationships incredibly well and how to sustain those over the long term. And potentially through a different set of academics working through different challenges with community partners over a longer period of time. And that kind of knowledge will always be needed as a resource in doing engaged work really well. I see that particularly with communities that I'm working with now, which is slightly different from the way it's done in South Africa, but equally interesting. So working with groups, communities of people. And I see a comment in the chat, by the way, that asks who is the community. So I'm going to not answer that now, but speak to a diverse way to think about communities. So I work now with communities of people who have lived experience of particular issues. For example, communities of people who have experienced human trafficking, communities of people who have experienced domestic violence, communities of people who are experiencing mental health challenges, such as severe mental health challenges, such as having psychosis and being on particular medications for that. Now, these different community groups that people work with in the context that I'm working in clinical trials, will often be sustained through different projects that are going on in the university to answer different particular questions for those groups, bringing in experts who can really help them solve the particular challenge that they have now. So community development itself works in that spiral. We don't solve challenges and then there's no more challenges. There are no communities in which there are no challenges. So challenges will be ongoing in communities that we're working with. And that might require different people to come through. So I hope that kind of makes sense, Pedro.
So, Sharli, I know you made reference to the question that's in the chat, and I'm going to take it that part of your response was in relation to that. I'm going to and that's been asked by sorry. I was saying I want to check if there's anything else Dr. Sharli wants to add to the question that's been asked by Katie Pepper in the chat, or are you happy to have leave it where you touched it upon?
Yeah, I think I'm happy to leave it there.